1949, he developed a normative script for the language he was trying to transliterate from the original symbols. And by 1952, he'd made the great breakthrough of discovering that this script represented a spoken Greek language, after which point he was able to go on and, with the help of his colleagues around the world, decipher the script. It was an extraordinary point of light in the grey post-war years. It was an act of brilliance and an act of sort of heroic endeavour, which probably for us nowadays can be paralleled by Andrew Wiles, his breaking down, or his cracking of the Fermat's last theorem, which was done a couple of years ago, where the world's press became overnight shouted aloud the sort of the fame of this person who'd made the great step forward. And this is what Michael Ventris did. Unfortunately, after his tragic death at the age of 36 in 1956, Betty Ventris started in conjunction with the Institute of Classical Studies and the AA, the Michael Ventris Memorial Fund Award, which has since then every year given out sums of money for young scholars such as myself and many others who've benefited from these sums and been able to go on and use the work done with that money as a foundation for future careers. And it's on behalf of the fund that we ask Oliver Cox tonight to give us some insight from those years spent together into the extraordinary personality of Michael Ventris. So I welcome you very much to discuss it.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. It's very nice. Can everybody hear me all right? Right at the back of the room. No hands up, so I think that the acoustics... I've got two microphones so that everything should be all right. It's very nice to see a number of friendly faces here of people who knew Michael as I did. My purpose tonight is to try to give an insight, as Susan quite rightly has indicated, of the man. So much has been written about him as a decipherer that people sometimes regard him as something just superhuman and not human, but he was a warm human being. And my purpose tonight is to show how the obsession, Susan was quite right, the obsession with Linear B was always there in the background whilst he was struggling, and sometimes against the struggle to become an architect and to do architectural work on a scale which he wanted and was capable of doing. I only knew him from 1946, when I came to the AA after the war, and although it was only for 10 years, he died in 1956, that I knew him, that was a third of his short and tragically short life. But in those 10 years, not only did he build up his stature as an architect, but he deciphered Linear B. And this talk really is strictly chronological, because two different strains were taking place at the same time, trying to build up his profession and at the same time carry out something that was or became a complete obsession with him. So that before 46, I have to rely on other people's research, and a lovely little book called Michael Ventris Remembered was done by the students of his old school, Stowe. And that research is what I start off with, right back in 1922 when he was born. His parents, his father was an army officer, his mother was half Polish. Her father was Polish, her mother English. The name was Janasz. And because his father suffered from tuberculosis, the family did when Michael was quite a young baby of only 2 or so, go to Switzerland for his father's health. By the time Michael was 7 years old, he had learnt Polish on his mother's knee. He was fluent in German, in French, and in Schweizerdeutsch. And soon after that, I just only this week discovered a little piece of literature that he'd acquired at the age, I think, of 8, on the decipherment of Egyptian signs, and that little book is in the display upstairs. It is in German. He went to Stowe School. Sadly, his parents were divorced by that time, and when his mother spoke to the headmaster of the school, she referred to him, to Michael, as someone who was already reading, and I quote from what she said in the letter to him, quite advanced works in language and archaeology. This was at the age of 13 or so. He had a remarkable teacher of Greek at Stowe School, Patrick Hunter. And this man took a party of schoolboys when Michael was 14 years old to Burlington House to hear a lecture by Sir Arthur Evans to celebrate the 50th year anniversary of the archaeological work at Knossos. Arthur Evans was 85 years old at the time, and Patrick Hunter remembers that when Evans was describing the Linear B Script, a little voice was piping up at the back of the class, so to speak, which said, "Do you mean, sir, that it has never been deciphered?" And the answer was yes. So from that time on, it seems to me that the obsession started. Sadly, his father died of TB shortly after that time, and his mother, Dorothea, was one of the first tenants and occupiers of the flat at the top of High Point 1. She was clearly a great patron and member of the pioneer architectural group that was over here during the war years. She was a personal friend of Gropius and of Breuer, and was a champion of the modern movement. Because of this, she corresponded with Breuer, and we have her letters to Breuer in which she was concerned about the future of Michael's education, and Breuer advised, and I will quote from him in a moment. In 1939, remember I mentioned her father was Polish. He had, at the time of Munich, come over to England, but in 1939 he lost all of his property. He was a man of considerable wealth. He lost all his property in Poland, lost all his friends, and tragedy struck. And although he was quite an old man, it killed him off. And sadly, his death was quickly followed by that of Dorothea herself. So Michael was left alone, 1939, with his father having died, his grandfather having died, his mother having died. And another member of the pioneer architectural and art circle at the time, Naum Garbo and his wife, really took the place of mother and father to Michael. He carried on at the flat in High Point on his own, and received a letter from Breuer in which Breuer advised him to come to the AA. And Breuer said, "There seems to be a fresh wind blowing through the place." This I'm quoting from as indeed he was quite right, there was. It was more of a hurricane. He also said in the same letter, "There's an excellent educator in that country, who I know well, J.L. Martin. Your mother will know him because he was one of the group working in the group called Circle, with Garbo and Moore and, well, you will know the names." But Michael showed his extraordinary power of concentration and determination, because in spite of these tragedies which have struck him, he worked at getting a portfolio together and entered the AA in 1940. Now, Lois Ventris, who we knew as Betty Knox Niven, had already been, and we knew her well, at the school. She came the year before. And, but in his preparation, while he was preparing to enter the AA, he knocked off a 26-page article on Linear B in which he acknowledged the assistance, who had been writing to him, of Sir Arthur Evans. And when he entered the AA, he then, it only took him a year to fall in love with Betty, and he married her, and during the war years they produced Nicky and Tessa, who is here, and Michael shot off into the RAF, where he refused to be a pilot because he thought that was a dull job. He wanted to be a navigator, where he could enjoy sitting there doing trigonometry. Now, we start with the slides. If we could just have the lights off. And it's a funny slide. Now, can you see on the right here? Am I in the way? Good. This top flat there is their flat at High Point. And although it isn't in that flat now, it's been carefully moved to the house that Michael built later. This is the Breuer settee, on which I slept many nights. And this is the Breuer radio cabinet, also moved. John Renton's house. Thank you, John, for allowing me to photograph it. But there it is, still there. And that was Breuer's design, which Dorothea Ventris found so warm and comforting in those war years. This is the first project we ever did at the AA. We did as ordinary students separately, but we actually did the research together. And during the course of that, Michael produced a thing that he called the dangleometer, which is a sort of Abney level. You looked through, and with his knowledge of trig, you could actually get the heights of the buildings. He also had another machine that he'd invented called the perspector, and this machine was a sort of arm, which a calibrated arm, which went to the left and to the right. And I'm not getting forward. I'm pressing the button. Thank you. And this was a diagram from Michael's little booklet on how to use the perspectron, which actually showed that you could, by moving the arm left and right, you could actually get calibrated or coordinate dimensions from which you could draw the perspective. Then you repeated the same thing vertically. And the interesting thing was that this is what we would now call a digital system with these numbers and coordinates. It was actually a precursor of the current computerized perspective machines. And just to digress for a moment, in the following year, 1947, was the centenary year of the AA, and almost as a joke, because we heard that he had declined the invitation from the council, we on the students' committee, including Michael, and Bernard, now Sir Bernard Fielden, who was chairman at the time, invited Corb over. And he came. And sitting in this very room, in a corner, there's a table over there, we discussed many things, including perspective drawing. And he, after Michael had explained to Corb the nuances of the perspector, Corb said, "Oh, well, I don't bother with anything like that. You see, what I do," and this is a real scoop, what I do is when I do an interior perspective, I put the vanishing point for the right hand over there on the left, I put the vanishing point for the left walls over there on the right, and sure enough, if you look at the books, this is exactly what he does do, and then I get the impression that I'm in the place. And of course, I've got no time for these camera views of an interior. So, typical Michael, quite undaunted, as he was later on with professors in the field of philology and history and archaeology, quite undaunted, he went on, and together we patented the design, and this very funny old-fashioned drawing, which looks as if it's about 1850, is the patent office's drawing of the actual patent. I thought you'd be amused to see that. I know Michael would have loved to have seen that on the screen. So the next is a project we did jointly together. It was for it was a group project. 4 of us worked on it. That's Betty and Michael. Graham Shankland, we had met together, all the 4 of us, really for the first time. Betty was the only link between us. Immediately after the one, we decided we would work in a group. And this is very important because Michael believed that group working was the way of working. And we all felt very strongly about this. That time, the AA had actual clients brought in, and the client that we worked for, and he came to and discussed the brief with us, was Alan Lane. The way in which we worked was to produce a series of alternate plans. Some of you who were at the AA at the time will remember all these alternatives explained in the final project, which was really more about the method than the actual scheme, and did show us that Michael had a fantastic power of analysis. He was also a brilliant draftsman. This is one of his drawings. He also was a superb model maker, and that is his little model of the Penguin Book Centre. Now, at the same time as he was doing this, he produced a sort of schema for the whole of architecture, typical of Michael. And here's the first of the Ventris grids. We come to those later, and they were an integral part of the decipherment. I think it was Graham Shankland, more than Michael, who believed that everything should go in 3s. He would always say, if you're speaking, never make more than 3 points. And here is, conveniently, Michael used firmness, commodity, firmness, and delight as his 3 main vertical columns, and then the stages of design, and then the people for whom design was concerned. This rule of 3 was something that he also applied, Michael, when he wrote in the Architectural Students magazine Plan, of whom he was co-editor at the time with Sam Scoro, who I see is here. And in plan number 2, he conducted a symposium on group working. The people he interviewed were Howard Robertson, who was then president and also working on the United Nations building with Corb, Stuart Johnson Marshall, Carl Koch, David Goddard, a teacher at the school, and myself. And when he was actually writing up this thesis on group working, typical Michael, he put in his own views. His own views here, and I quote, were the 3 golden rules. 1, put down conceitedly every requirement, argument, inspiration, and mind's eye picture that occurs during the design process as concisely, enthusiastically, and pictorially as possible. 2, phrase your conclusions, set out and colour your pictures in such a way that they will mean most to you or a colleague at a second reading. 3, file everything where you will still find it fresh and clean tomorrow or in a year's time. Architecture needs paper in order to take form. Enjoy and respect your material. Now, we managed to persuade the school to allow 3 of us, Graham, Michael and myself, to go to Sweden, hopefully to get work. Before we went, Michael taught us Swedish. Well, he taught himself Swedish in 2 weeks, and by the time we got to Sweden, he was quite fluent. It took me another month to be able to do the shopping. And here, the top drawing there shows Michael's drawing. It's from a letter to Betty of the little flat in Spångavägen near Bromma, if you know Stockholm, where the airport is. And there, that little 2-story block on the ground floor, we shared rooms and lived together for a period of about 2 months. The drawing down below shows Michael's little drawing just after his birthday. There's a reference to a green marzipan gâteau, which was his birthday cake Graham and I bought for him, and a drawing of me. But of course I was rude enough. We were all mucking in. He was a man with a tremendous sense of humour, and I said, that doesn't look like me, much too thin and aesthetic. So he said, all right, you can do the drawings on the letters that go to Betty, because little Nick, his son, was about 5 or thereabouts, and he wanted to see some jolly drawings. So I did some jolly drawings, and that's why you've got some ridiculous caricatures of Michael and Graham and I in Stockholm. The little drawing at the top right-hand side is typical. There's Michael in the distance with his back to us, shooting ahead, and Graham and I running to keep up with him. The bottom left-hand drawing shows me. The words on the back, I do know sufficient Swedish to be able to translate what's on the thing. Nymålat is newly painted, and I'm just learning the hard way, the language. And on the right at the bottom there, Michael is investigating the workings of the refuse chute. These, I think, speak for themselves. Michael on the left, Graham and I are down below searching for the carrots. This is rather a rude one. I'm sorry about this one, but it's got in by mistake. Graham and I are sitting on the settee, suffering after having a rather bout of prunes, which were not properly marinated. And here is a letter from Michael, and this is a reference to the extraordinary ability that Michael had as a script writer. The first half of the letter, apologies to Betty for including it here, but the reason is when you see this writing, she would not have recognized it as Michael's at all. Halfway down the letter, I'll just point to it here. The writing it says, "I don't think this is my new writing," and it's simply what he had tried to train himself to do, because this was the writing on the working drawings of the office in which he managed to get a job. Graham and I never did. He did, with his Swedish, of course. And then his ordinary writing is at the bottom of the letter. And this shows this extraordinary capacity to be able to write neatly without a great deal of trouble in a completely different type of script. He was working in cooperativa under an interesting architect, Lennart Uhlin, who became a good friend. And at the same time as he was doing that, he'd got the Jarvis Scholarship, a scholarship awarded by the AA, and this meant measuring up buildings and so forth. And there, I've got the tape up there, and people are a little surprised. And this is typical Michael. He would sit there, absolutely concentrated, doing his little notes for the Jarvis Scholarship, quite oblivious of the fact that it wasn't entirely easy. Here was a page from his notes of those very balconies we were measuring and details. And it shows the extraordinary way in which Michael could really almost doodle and draw things precisely, although they were rough. All his doodles were like this, and pages of his notebooks are full of little sketches of this kind. Here's another page on row houses in Sweden. And then when we returned here, in plan number 1, again the student magazine, he wrote a thesis on what he called function and arabesque, which is really functionalism and a future for a more enriched way of expressing functionalism. The little drawings at the top of the little row houses, star houses in the centre, and 1, 2, 3 at the bottom show his analysis of classicism, the Korb analysis of the new freedom of functionalism, and on the right a Swedish effort at an actual place of decoration applied to a modern building. I quote what Michael said in this article. He said, "The enemy has always been the classical. The columned building insults its surroundings by its timeless irrelevance." So he was a very strong functionalist, but he felt something should be done to try and enrich it. And he held the question open at the end as to how that could be done. In one day, he and Betty did a little day sketch as one of their student projects for a little house. They found a site. In fact, I think they did think they might actually build on it at the top of West Hill Highgate. It's a little split-level cell, and shows a very strong Swedish influence. And there's Michael's perspective of the interior. Now, at that time, we were developing, Michael and Graham and I, an approach to a subject which really was a methodical approach to design. And although it appeared in plan, again, under my name, it was in fact a joint operation between the three of us and expressed our philosophy. And the first point, again 3 points, the first point in this design philosophy was that an architect should be a competent and objective critic. The second point was that he should possess self-confidence, and I quote from the article, "It's necessary for the architect to make an imaginative jump ahead of his knowledge of the problem. This act is repeated continually during the design process, throughout which there should be a controlled reaction between self-confidence and self-criticism." And the third point, the objective at each stage should not be a simple conclusion, but a series of alternatives. The design thus proceeds by means of trial and error, a period of imaginative freedom followed by an objective post-mortem. Where a new factor emerges late in the design, the previous conclusion should be revised in the light of the new requirement. I read that out in full, but it's highly relevant to the actual method by which he actually achieved the decipherment. Now, following the AA work, we were able to do, as an AA project, a competition with the help of a fully qualified architect. We were still students, and that was fellow Atkinson. And you see at the top H9. This is the 9th version of the H plan that you've got a sketch from Michael's notebook. And it shows the immaculate way in which all these plans were all put on a, well, it would be an A4 sheet now, but it was a foolscap sheet at its time, and showed all the plans and the diagrams of how they worked. This TUC competition we didn't win, and I think the winner deserved to win, but this did have one or two quite interesting features. The ground floor plan showed this rather large auditorium. Michael worked out a system by which all the speakers could hear the main speaker and see and hear one another at the requisite distance, inventing a sort of mathematical formula for doing it. It took up much of the ground floor, but in this plan, unlike the one as built, the entrance is on the right-hand side next to the YMCA building, and the entrance is a rather grand, well, it's actually an atrium, because the floors above go through, and the library on the first floor, on the top floor, has a large hole in the floor to light this area, and above the main conference chamber, the committee rooms have little balconies looking onto this atrium. Quite an interesting solution. I don't show the elevations. Personally, I'm not very proud of them, but I think the plan is quite a good one. It was illustrated later in the AJ. The next project is one of the final projects, our final project in the AA. It was a group project, and this plan, I see, was drawn half by me and half by Michael. He led us a good old dance trying to keep up his standard of draftsmanship. He was a superb draftsman, and I can illustrate that with the next one, which is the elevations of this, and they're all done. All this hatching is in fact not one of these things you stick on. They hadn't got that at that time. It was all done by cross-hatching painfully, one line after another. His drawing technique was quite amazing. Now, following this project, we managed to persuade each other that a trip doing the grand tour would be the right thing to do. And Michael, who had a little more money than we had, was able to purchase a shooting brake, and these funny little drawings, I'll whip through them quickly, show us the top right-hand corner is the shooting brake, heavily loaded down at the back, going on by crane to the Townsend ferry, crossing to France, and the bottom, if you see anybody in a little pinky shirt, I'll show you here, the pink shirt, here, lost him on various occasions, that's Michael. He did have a pink shirt, but didn't wear it the whole holiday. But these drawings were done immediately afterwards, and so they were fresh in my mind, and that was to distinguish him. There he is, second drawing at the top, in the false perspective of the Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza. There you can see him at the bottom, the second drawing on the bottom, with his pink shirt again, speaking Schweizerdeutsch. They said, "What part of Switzerland do you come from?" When I asked what they'd said to him, getting us into the Scala Regia, which was not open at that time to tourists in the Vatican. And this is, or proved to be, a prophetic and a rather important drawing. So I've blown this one up rather fuller. There's Michael. He seems to be dressed in a suit, and the rest of us look very dishevelled. Me flustered behind, carrying all the stuff, and Betty and Graham even further back. Now, the reason why this was drawn within a month of the event, I have to tell you what the story was. When we were coming back towards the south of France, we thought all of us were going to see Corb's Unité, which was building at the time, nearly completion. "No," said Michael, "I must get back." And back it was no arguing with him, back we came. And so, we felt a little bit miffed by having to dash back, and we didn't know. And it was like, this is typical of being with Michael, it was like living on the ground floor with someone, so charming, so nice to work with, but he had a little staircase up to an upstairs room in his mind, and he had gone up there during this holiday, and that's where he was, and we couldn't reach him. Of course, later on we discovered what it was up in that room, but at this time we hardly knew. Because we'd spend all this time together doing all this design work and looking at buildings and studying and measuring, and of course loved the man, but he had another life, and that life was this obsession, which of course now begins to come to the fore. Following the return from this Italian journey, Michael did go, but I think he went up to see Sir John Myers, and according to Betty, he came back with a flea in his ear. I don't think that they got on very well at that time. It was very difficult for Michael trying to prove his case for the work he was doing on Linear B, when people realized his age and the fact he was an architectural student. And Sir John Myers was anything but either, a very distinguished scholar. And I don't think it was easy for Michael to hold his own. After this, so it was a parting of the ways. I went off, as Susan said, as described to you, to Hertfordshire County Council, plunged straight away into exciting design and getting buildings up and so forth, which Mike was a little bit jealous, because he and Graham went off to the School for Planning and Regional Reconstruction. And I'd like just to quote what Graham, sadly now deceased, said about Michael at this time. I quote from Graham Shanklin. "Town planning was at that time a rather nebulous, ill-defined subject. Michael was deeply furious about the sloppy and illogical way that most of the lectures were put together. He found it irritating to be taught by men who were ignorant of logic." Now, during this time at the school, clearly he began to have a little bit more evening homework. And in his spare time, and I did see some of this being done, he produced a questionnaire, and this is the first stage, as I call it, of the decipherment. We're in 48-49. And here you see Michael having seen a great deal of literature on the script and the script itself, decided there was something that should be normalized. In fact, he told us we all had to use what he called norm script, and we did our best. I could only do it sloping. He could do it upright. It's just like stencils, which he used for this, you see. This is all stencil. But the actual signs are Michael's normalization of Linear B. The first time they were really clearly shown, and in the little tiny boxes at the side he shows how 3 experts in the field had annotated them. This is Myers himself, Evans, and Caratelli, who did a great work on the script. But Michael's contribution at this stage was sending a questionnaire to 12 experts throughout the world in many different languages. He was working, saying a number of questions about what they felt the script was and so forth. By this time he had established it was what we call a syllabary. In other words, it was a combination of consonant and vowel, because there were 85 symbols in different signs, and that was many, many more than you would get in an alphabetic system. He was at that stage and normalizing and asking questions. In other words, here was the beginning of group working on the international plane. He was trying to get other people to contribute and not pretending that he was going to do it all on his own. Whilst this was going on, we did look at, appointed by Hugh Casson, again we did it with fellow Atkinson, an information office in Leicester Square for the Festival of Britain. And I have, thanks to Alicia Totalos, pages from his notebook, and I've put 3 successive pages. You will not believe it, but it shows how Michael's mind worked. This was a little study of a colour study of how to try and do drawings in colour. The next page showed, first of all, at the top, a machine for doing perspective drawings using light, and below it, a machine for reading in bed or on a chaise longue. Now, believe it or not, this is the next page. We have the dates on them. This is the next page in the same book. And here he was, busily answering his own questionnaire. Now, he had finished at this stage with the planning school, and he took a job under David and Mary Mead, working in the then department, the Ministry of Education, doing in the research and development section, where he worked on bulletins and again on one of their development projects, which was the Wokingham School. And he produced masses of nicely projected perspectives, and then imposed little colour schemes on them. So this was really a study not so much of the interior as what you saw through it. And by chance, as I was employed later on the same project, there is a drawing of a part of the interior of that school which Michael had worked on. But again, at the same time as he was working at the Ministry of Education, so I learned from the Meds, he came on time in the morning, he left on time in the evening, and then he started his other obsession. And that obsession then was a really serious stage in the decipherment. And this is the drawing, or the diagram, or one of the diagrams that accompanied what Michael called, the mid-century report. Now that was an analysis. Here you see the grids again, famous Ventris grid. Along the top are the names of 9 of the scholars who had given him answers to his questionnaire. Down on the left-hand side are all 85 of the signs, with everybody's latest thoughts and what those signs meant, including, of course, Michael's own comments. So this mid-century report really contained a mass of collective knowledge and information. At the end of this mid-century report, Michael added a little note, and this read as follows. I have good hopes that a number of people working on these lines, i.e. establishing relationships between signs and analysing them, their groupings, will before long enable a satisfactory solution to be found. To them I offer my best wishes, being forced by other work to make this my last small contribution. But it wasn't, was it? And he didn't stop. He, in fact, received more material, and the obsession really took over. He left the ministry and found sufficient money. Our friends at the ministry said he was ringing the stockbroker. I know what that was about, in order to be able to survive for a year or so without work and concentrate on the script, which is what he did. And in the course of 1951, he worked almost continuously on it. Much to Betty Ventris's concern, because they'd acquired the site for their new house in 51, and there's a drawing in early 51 for the first sketch of the house, or a house on the site. But in January 51, he started a new stage, and this I call the third stage, which is work notes. He produced 20 of these and 200 pages of analysis. I'm also told at the same time he had a keyboard in his dining room in flat 47 High Point, which was like a keyboard in a hotel, 85 hooks and 85 symbols. And he was playing with these in order to try and get the symbols, the right key in the right hole. It was one of his techniques. But I think by about 24th of March, I have the date precisely, 24th of March 1952, work note number 19 appeared with diagrams, and I can imagine Betty saying, "What about the drawings for the house?" Because on the same day as that work note went out, which was very near the end, this drawing was done. It's dated up at the top right corner for the house. And as certainly the Rentons will know, this is not the house that they acquired from the Ventrises. It is a sketch which has in fact got the bathroom in a different place and the staircase, a straight staircase, and compare that. I put this drawing the same way around so that you can see the comparison between them. It's a split level, bathroom in a different position, and this is the drawing. He did a set of drawings. There must have been about 15 working drawings, and he completed that within 3 weeks of this. And then back again onto his obsession, which was the final stage of the decipherment. Now, an interesting thing happened just after this stage in about May of 1952. We had a mutual friend who was a wife of an architect who we worked with, both of us, who was a producer for the third program. And she was invited to dinner. And at this dinner, for which Michael apparently was rather late, he said, "I really think I've got somewhere on this." And so this was Prudence Smith, the producer, went back to her boss and said, "I think we've got a scoop for the third program. Michael Ventris has deciphered the script." And they, of course, first of all didn't believe him. And then the truth came out, he did persuaded him. He was a very modest, shy person. He didn't really want to put it in the floodlights, but they persuaded him to do this broadcast. But it was at the time of well, I will just jump ahead a tiny bit to the work note number 20, which John Chadwick, with whom he worked later, described as the pathbreaker. This was the one in which he actually showed that the script was Greek. Now, a few more drawings. Just there, his perspective of the house, and there's the house as built, and there's his change of address card with a little house in the background. Now, I should add that doing all this in 3 weeks was a remarkable thing. At the same time carrying this obsession, this thing that was occupying him almost continuously. He had to design this, as some of you may remember, for £1,000, for 1,000 square feet, and for 1.1 standards of timber. In other words, the restrictions were very considerable. We come back to that later. But then we skip just again to this path-breaking work note number 20, in which Michael prefaced this with the words, "Are the Gnossos and Pylos tablets written in Greek?" This is the burden of the broadcast, of course. And at the end, this is again typical of the man, at the end he added this little postscript. "It may be as well not to start with any preconceived notions about phonetic values or about the language relationships. The note is in the nature of a frivolous digression and is not intended to prejudice the analysis of the whole Linear B material from Scripta Minoa and the revised index." So there he was, still saying, well, don't take it too seriously, I may be all quite wrong, but in fact we know from this dinner party with Prudence Smith that he said, I think I've got it. Well, if we could have the tape now, you will hear a little excerpt from this broadcast.
It's often alleged to be quite impossible to decipher a set of inscriptions where both the writing and the language are unknown quantities and where there's no bilingual to help us. But provided there's enough material to work on, the situation isn't hopeless at all. It simply means that instead of a mechanical piece of decoding, a rather more subtle process of deduction has to be undertaken. It's rather like doing a crossword puzzle on which the positions of the black squares haven't been printed for you.
Okay, that's all we want from that, because he then goes on to say, and I'm afraid I haven't got that on tape, I'd like to have, I'm quoting from Michael, from this broadcast, "For a long time I thought that Etruscan might afford the clue we were looking for. But during the last few weeks I have come to the conclusion that the Knossos and Pylos tablets must, after all, be written in Greek, a difficult and archaic Greek, seeing that it is 500 years older than Homer and written in a rather abbreviated form, but Greek nevertheless," at the end of the broadcast. Following following the broadcast, which was listened to by John Chadwick, Chadwick contacted Michael, and a very fruitful liaison between the two led to the production of lectures and talks, and they wrote books together, and really the obsession became his life work. But it wasn't quite what Michael was wanting. Here, this is the work note number 20 that was the pathbreaker referred to by John Chadwick. And it shows the along the top, there's a famous Michael Ventris grid. It has the vowel signs, and down the left-hand side are the syllabary. Because this is the following year, and while the world was echoing to the name of Michael Ventris, he thought clearly he ought to get back to architecture. And what about that 1,000 square foot house? Here was his idea for an expanding house, which started with 1,000 square foot, and he added 500 in the garage on, and it was one of the early stages of expanding houses. And this is one of the last drawings he had, because later in that year, an archaeologist, Carl Blagan, working in Greece, found a tablet, a new tablet, with the Linear B inscription on it, to which he applied Michael Ventris's translation system, and telephoned Michael Ventris in great excitement, because there was a little picture of a little tripod with 3 legs and a number of handles, and the word, according to Michael Ventris's system, was tripodes, and that established it once and for all, that in fact Michael was right. Sadly, he was a modest man, Michael, and he found this absolute stardom that was descended on him was not to his taste at all. The obsession was not with Greek, it was not with archaeology, it was with teasing out a problem using the system which we had developed together for architecture, with grids and with superb graphics, and his fantastic patience and capacity to work. I've never known a person to work like this, all hours of the night. Well, he really, at this stage, had too much to Chadwick and others' dismay, really, did not want to go on to do Linear B or Linear A or another undeciphered script. He wanted to get back to architecture. But the obsession had sort of led him off into the stratosphere, and he was receiving doctorates from Uppsala University and accolades and having to do lectures and write books. And so it wasn't until 1956 that he was awarded by the Architects' Journal a fellowship in the subject of information for the architect. But it is my belief that basically that was not the role he wanted. He wanted really to get down as a team member in a team and design buildings and leave the obsession behind. And the question that people often ask, well, had he lived, what sort of an architect would he have made? And I think there are 2 answers to that question. Had he, like I did, having left the AA, plunged straight into the maelstrom of architectural design after that, I think he would have been a superb team worker. He would have gone on to be a leader in the field of computerization of design, and he would be been a brilliant planner, and would have been not a prima donna. He would have hated the idea of that. He only wanted to be a good, effective member of the team, very humble and modest. And that's what he would have liked, but he would have done it brilliantly, and the team he would have worked with would have done great things. But we would not have had the decipherment of Linear B had he done that. Instead, he chose the obsession to take over, and then it led him away from architecture. And it is my belief that it would have been almost superhuman, although he was superhuman, to be able to have got back to a humble role as a team member, which is the role that he would have wanted to do had he not become a superstar. That is the story of the man, and the story of really a battle between an obsession and the profession of architecture. Thank you very much.
Oliver, would you take some questions? Well, thank you for that fascinating talk. But if anyone would like to ask any questions, any queries unanswered, or of Oliver, I'd be welcome to take some. No, I think that was an indication of the comprehensive nature of your talk. And now pass over now to Dennis Sharp.
Well, what can one say after such an illuminating address? A wonderful personal survey of a remarkable friendship. I came a generation after that, Oliver, into the 50s. And when we were doing fourth year under Arthur Korn, another great group worker of that time, who was trying very diligently to bring together architecture and planning, the name that kept cropping up was Michael Ventris. He's very good at first year, Arthur Korn would say. Very, very good teacher. You should get him for your crits. And occasionally we were fortunate enough to have Michael for those long crits. So there are, I believe, certain names and indeed places and faces that seem never to be forgotten. And it's funny, isn't it? Time and time again, the name of Michael Ventris crops up. Not just when you see those books on Linear B or the occasional reference in radio or TV, but when you're talking about that period, that immense period of architecture which was concerned with research, and what an odd phrase that is in modern educational terms, architectural research based on analysis, based on the logic of the plan, and indeed bedded and wedded to the notion of modern architecture and Le Corbusier's modernism. But there was this other side. I was here the day after he died, and the whole place had a kind of aura of uncertainty and sadness about it. I shall never forget that. And in his AA Journal obituary, the writer later claimed that nobody could replace Michael Ventris. He applied his rigorous and vigorous methodology to his own researches in a way that few of us ever have an opportunity. And there was there a challenge then for the conducting of architectural research in a scientific as well as an intuitive way. What you've done tonight, Oliver, is to give us an insight into that methodology as well as into the man. And may I, on behalf of the AA, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Thank you.
And could we now invite you all up to see perhaps the exhibition on the first floor and join us for a glass of wine? That was a wonderful talk. Oh, I really thank you so much for it.
Well,
so interesting.
I'm so glad you were able to be here.
Take that off.
Thank you.
Otherwise you'll find yourself being completely recorded.